Hey everyone, welcome to class. Today we'll be continuing our lesson on acrylic by looking at some practical acrylic techniques. In our previous lesson, we looked at the foundational aspects of using acrylic paints and explored its differences from watercolor. Today, we'll be looking at some practical techniques that can take your acrylic paintings to the next level. We'll be looking at various blending and edge control techniques, and I'll give you some insight on mixing complex colors. We'll be building off all the techniques from our previous acrylic lesson. So if you're struggling to control your brush, mix your paint, and apply your paint consistently, then I would encourage you to continue to practice those techniques before continuing with this lesson. It's important to know how to control any medium before looking into techniques that build off those control skills. With that said, all the techniques we'll learn today can be used in many different circumstances and will require critical thinking when it comes to applying them to an actual painting. So as we learn today, be thinking about how you may be able to use these techniques in your paintings. Let's get set up for our lesson. You'll need watercolor paper, a palette or a paper plate, your acrylic paints, a napkin, a cup of water, a flat brush, a pencil, and a ruler. Like our previous lessons, we'll be dividing our paper into two sections using our ruler and pencil. Once we're finished with our line, we can put our ruler away since we won't need it for the rest of the lesson. Before we begin painting, we're going to draw some shapes for us to paint in. This will give us more practice on brush and edge control as we learn these new techniques. As you follow along and draw these shapes, try to match the size of the shapes that I create. Keep in mind we'll be painting inside these shapes, so don't make them too small. In the top section, let's draw a circle on the far left side. The diameter of the circle should be at least 2 inches. We can draw two large horizontal rectangles on the right side of the top section. Make sure they're not touching each other or the edge of the paper. In the bottom half of our paper, draw a large rectangle. Make sure you keep at least 1 inch of border around this rectangle from the edge of the paper. Next, we'll mix a green color using the techniques we learned in our previous lesson. Paint in the bottom right rectangle in the top half of our paper. Go ahead and wash your brush and leave the rectangle to dry. The first technique we'll be looking into is blending. Because acrylic is an opaque medium, blending will differ from how we blend in watercolor. The most notable difference is that we'll be using paint to transition, darken, and lighten colors instead of just water. First, let's look at darkening or lightening our colors. In painting, when we darken a color, we call it shading, and when we lighten a color, we call it tinting. We'll do this by adding black to darken a color and white to lighten a color. There are different methods to do this. The first method we'll look into is the simplest to achieve a transition from light to dark, but gives us the least amount of control of the methods we'll learn in our lesson. Let's start by putting out some blue and some white acrylic. first, let's paint the outside edge of our circle blue. We want this paint to be thick and to remain wet till we add our white. Paint in towards the middle of the circle, but leave the center of the circle empty. Now let's wash our brush thoroughly. Scoop up some white paint and paint in the center of the circle. Again, we want this paint to be thick and to remain wet throughout this exercise. Wash your brush one more time and dry it off. Now, we'll use our brush to blend the blue and white paint together. We want to keep the center of the circle pure white and the edge of our circle pure blue, so be sure not to touch these areas with your brush. We also want to dedicate one side of our brush to be against the white paint, and one side of our brush to be against the blue paint. Now we can work our brush around the circle, blending the two colors by moving our brush back and forth between the white and blue paint. Again, make sure that the blue side of our brush stays on the blue side and the white side stays on the white side. In the ends, we should have a nice transition between blue and white. Like I mentioned before, this is one of the simplest ways to create a transition between two colors. We're basically creating a gradient by mixing wet paint on the paper that we're painting on. In the top right rectangle of our paper, we're going to look at another blending technique that is a little more complicated, but will give us more control over the transition between colors. Instead of transitioning the color on our paper, we're going to create a transition on our palette. This will allow us to control the transition, especially for longer gradients. Let's go ahead and put out some red paint. We're going to need a good amount of red paint for this exercise. Next, we can get a small amount of black paint and mix it into one side of our red paint pile. As we add this black paint, we're going to extend it away from the side of the pile we added it to. Keep on adding black paint and extending the pile till the color looks pure black. Go ahead and wash out your brush, and now we'll add white to the opposite side of our red paint pile. Again, keep on adding white paint and extending the paint pile till it's pure white. Try to work quickly as we don't want the color to dry on our palette. Once you're done, wash your brush and begin applying your paint to the rectangle on the top right of our paper. Let's start by painting the middle of the rectangle with our pure red. Go ahead and begin adding the darker colors next to the red color on our paper. We'll do this by taking the colors from the sections of the gradient we mixed on our palette. It's important to paint over the previous section a little and to brush back and forth so that the wet paint blends together. Keep on transitioning the red color until we get to black at the far left side of the rectangle. Go ahead and wash your brush and begin transitioning the other side of our rectangle, moving from our pure red to pure white. This technique gives us much more control and is more technical and time sensitive, as the paint on our palette must remain wet throughout the whole transition. Our next blending technique will allow us to create a gradient while our paint is dry. We call this technique dry brushing. Dry brushing is when we take a dry brush and load it with a little acrylic paint. Instead of using wet paint to mix our color, we'll use pressure to control how much paint is dispensed onto our paper. This is very similar to our lesson on shading with a pencil. The more pressure we add to our brush and the more strokes we make over one section of the paper, the more color will be dispensed. By controlling the pressure and amount of strokes over an area, we can control how much paint is dispensed. The bottom rectangle in our top section that we painted green should be dry by now. Let's start with our black color. Go ahead and scoop up some black paint, load your brush, and squeeze out any chunks of paint onto your palette. We can then dab our brush on a napkin. We want the bristles of our brush to be dry with as little paint on them as possible. Let's start with light strokes over the far left side of our rectangle. You can control how dark this side is by the amount of strokes you use and how much pressure you apply. As you move towards the middle of the green rectangle, use less pressure and less strokes. When you're done with the dark side, go ahead and wash your brush out. For the white side, we'll use the same steps we used to create the dark side. Use pressure and the amount of strokes to take your gradient from white to green in the middle of the rectangle. One thing to keep in mind is how dry your brush is throughout this dry brushing process. Make sure your brush doesn't fully dry out, otherwise we may damage our brush. This is a great way to create interesting textures in our gradients, and can come in handy when painting objects that don't have a smooth surface. Dry brushing and wet on wet blending are commonly used techniques to create transitions between light and dark areas in our paintings and for transitioning colors. It's good to practice making these transitions over large and small areas to see how much paint is needed and for understanding the workable time before the medium dries. Let's move on to the bottom half of our paper, where we're going to look at mixing complex colors. I would define a complex color as a color that's made up of more than two colors. Once we start looking at painting pictures that are representative of real life or have more complex color schemes, we need to know how to mix complex colors. Many of these colors will rely on us being able to notice subtle differences in value or saturation. We'll have to remain focused and careful with how much we mix our colors to see these subtle differences and know what to add to get our desired color. Today, we're going to look at the very basics of mixing complex colors by making saturated and neutral colors while also changing their values. We're going to do this by creating a simple picture of receding hills, similar to our exercise from episode 6 where we explored the illusion of depth. First, let's draw 5 hills in our rectangle. Once we have our hill sections drawn, let's mix our first color, which will be a dark blue. We can create this color by using black and blue mixed together. Go ahead and fill in the closest hill with this color. Next, we'll mix a blue with a little less black in it. After we mix our blue and black, we can add a small amount of white to our color. We want this color to look slightly lighter than the previous hill section. Keep in mind that the more white we add to the color, the lighter it will appear. Also, be aware that the more white we add, the less saturated the color will be. For this section, we want our color to still remain saturated, so keep this in mind while adding the white. Go ahead and fill in the next hill back with this color. For our next color, we want to start desaturating the blue so that it doesn't stand out as much as our first two hills. We can do this by adding the complementary color of blue to our color, which is orange. Mix a very small amount at first and observe the effect. If the color is still too saturated, try adding some more orange. If the color starts to look gray or even orange, then we've added too much. Remember, we want to desaturate our blue, but not change the blue to another color. We also want to add a little white to this color to lighten it up. This will help create atmospheric perspective in our image. For our fourth hill, we will really desaturate this color so that it's gray-blue. Mix more orange and white into this color and fill in the hill. Finally, for our last hill, we want it to be almost gray, meaning we'll add a lot of white and orange. Even though we know we'll add a lot of these two colors, still add them in small amounts at a time. In the end, we should have saturated dark hills in the foreground and desaturated light hills in the background. As you can see, we can enhance effects like atmospheric perspective by being able to control and add other elements in our picture like color. All of art is like this, in that we can use all the lessons of our past to inform our decisions in our present picture. Problem solving and creatively working our way through each piece is all a part of the beauty of image creating. The more obstacles we overcome in our journey of art, the more experience we have to make better and better decisions in our future pieces. With this lesson and the previous 11 lessons, we have explored the foundations of image creation. We've looked at various concepts, techniques, mediums, and attitudes when approaching our artwork. All this information, plus your hard work and practice, is giving you a foundation to build off of, and we're excited to see where it takes you. We wish you a fun and adventurous art journey, and it was a pleasure to have you in class.